Hello, you're watching Low Batteries, a look at video games and mental health. Today we're starting to branch out a little from previous videos and look at how mental disorders are portrayed in video games themselves. Specifically for this episode, we're going to be looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. You've almost certainly heard of it before, but given how much there is to PTSD, it's still important to define it before we can look at how it relates to games. This will only take a minute or two, so stick with me. My thanks to Pete Etchells, who was instrumental in helping me learn more about PTSD while researching this episode. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition in which someone who has been exposed to an intense, frightening emotional experience suffers from long-lasting changes in their behaviour, emotional state, and cognition, including changes to their thoughts, attention span, memory processes, their judgment, and reasoning abilities. PTSD's causes can be pretty varied. It can occur after someone has directly experienced or witnessed a traumatic event such as a violent assault, but it can also occur if someone learns that the event has happened to a loved one or a close friend. When someone suffers from PTSD, they often end up re-experiencing what happened to them. This can manifest in intrusive depressing thoughts, images, flashbacks, or nightmares. As a result, they may start to develop what's called phobic avoidance and psychological reactivity to reminders of the trauma. Put simply, if they're reminded of what happened to them in some way, they'll start experiencing a fear response and may try to escape the situation. Their heart rate will climb and they'll start sweating or hyperventilating. Other symptoms include sleep disturbances or insomnia, increased irritability, and having what's called an exaggerated startle response, screaming and jumping backward when someone shouts boo, for instance. Patients with PTSD can also suffer from a restricted range of emotions, a sense the future is bleak, or distorted thoughts about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event, leading the sufferer to believe it was their fault. The emotional symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder hew closely to those seen in depression sufferers. Indeed, depression and PTSD often co-occur with one another. Patients with PTSD tend to show noticeable reductions in the volume of two key areas of the brain, the hippocampus and the amygdala. Without getting too technical, the hippocampus is a major area of the brain involved in memory, so even while they keep reliving the traumatic event, sufferers can experience problems in learning and remembering new things. In other words, while they remember things they don't want to remember, they can't remember things they do want to remember. In short, PTSD is a multifaceted disorder that can be pretty debilitating. With that in mind, it's a shame the portrayal of post-traumatic stress disorder in games is, for the most part, fairly superficial. Characters who have experienced some trauma or other and can be said to be suffering from PTSD are 10 a penny, yet games rarely look closely at PTSD or try to explore it in any significant way. Instead, PTSD and trauma-related complications tend to be used as a mechanism by which to flesh out a character or give them some personal motivation. Writing on this topic, Matthew Bumbeloff and Adam Hentz from Indiana University said video game characters use trauma to manufacture identity. Examples of this in action are not hard to find.
I never asked for this.
Adam Jensen in Deus Ex Human Revolution is a prime example of the use of PTSD to give someone a backstory and personal motivation. Jensen's life is altered forever after a terrorist attack on his workplace robs him of his arms and, more importantly, his girlfriend, who is killed in the assault. Jensen is hardened both physically and mentally by this traumatic event. He's given physical augmentations and a brand new no-nonsense attitude. He shows some signs of being distressed and withdrawn from society. His bathroom mirror has been very deliberately smashed, for instance, but beyond this setup, Jensen's PTSD is never really explored. If anything, it's used to strengthen Jensen and to justify his actions throughout the game. Granted, your gameplay choices can put him on a more compassionate path, allowing him to at least touch on the emotional ramifications of his grief, but for the most part, Jensen is on a quest for vengeance. Max Payne is another good example of a character whose trauma is used to generate an identity.
No, please God, no.
After his wife and child are killed, Max spirals into a pit of despair that, if anything, makes him a more efficient killer. A great deal more time in Max Payne is dedicated to the psychological impact of trauma than in Deus Ex, but it still falls into the same trap whereby trauma is used to harden a character as if they're being tempered like a blade. In the context of the game and what you're trying to achieve, Max Payne's PTSD isn't debilitating. It doesn't hinder him, it makes him stronger. On the other end of the spectrum, PTSD is also portrayed in video games as a means by which to make someone's perception of reality untrustworthy. Take Clarke in Dead Space, for instance.
Isaac! You were drifting away for a moment there, Mr. Clarke.
The events of the first game are fairly spectacularly traumatic, and by the second game, he's experiencing some frightening hallucinations. Granted, some of this is explained away by the presence of the marker, a strange alien artifact, but given you start the second game in a straitjacket, I think it's fair to assert Visceral Games is at least hinting at a trauma-related mental disorder here. For the most part, it's used to mislead the player and try to scare them, playing on the sense of otherness that comes from a mental disorder. I'm not saying they tried to belittle mental disorder sufferers, and I do realise I'm talking about the realism of a character's PTSD in the context of a sci-fi game about necromorphic alien creatures, but it's a pretty reductive portrayal. Whether it's just a game or not, these representations can and do inform the way people perceive disorders such as PTSD, so it's unfortunate they're mostly employed as cheap plot devices. But that's not to say video games aren't capable of portraying mental disorders with some accuracy. While not the most fantastic game, Spec Ops the Line for the most part does a surprisingly good job of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, until it falls over spectacularly at the end, that is. We'll get to that in due course, so it's fair to say the rest of this video contains fairly massive spoilers for Spec Ops the Line and some fairly graphic content, so viewer discretion is advised.
What the hell?
Over the course of Spec Ops the Line, Captain Martin Walker and his squad mates go through a number of seriously traumatic events, starting with an attack by suspected insurgents and quickly escalating to having to kill fellow American soldiers after being mistaken for enemy combatants.
Don't let him back to cover!
While at the start of the game the dialogue between Walker's squad is pretty standard fare, comprised of military jargon like Tango Down, that dialogue gets more and more ragged as the action progresses and begins to take its toll.
Fuck you!
Walker especially goes from giving clipped orders to shouting abuse at his enemies, sometimes even screaming incoherently. He shouts things like,
Fucking stay down!
And
Kill is fucking confirmed!
Showing an increasing level of emotional involvement in something he had no difficulty doing as part of his job at the start of the game, despite the unpleasant nature of the work. The moment people remember most clearly from Spec Ops the Line is the segment in which Walker spots a bunch of enemies who will undoubtedly kill him if he is detected. Seeing no other option, he uses a white phosphorus mortar to kill them before having to move through the burning wreckage. At this point he discovers the soldiers were in fact helping a bunch of civilians, all of whom were killed by the mortar fire.
No, those can't be the civvies that got kidnapped. It's not possible.
From here, things quickly go downhill for Walker and his men. Their emotional states begin to resemble the list of symptoms used as diagnostic reference points for PTSD more and more closely, and the question of guilt shadows them for the rest of the game. Even the loading screens get in on the act, where before they gave helpful gameplay tips, they now say things like "this is all your fault," echoing the feelings of guilt that PTSD sufferers can experience, whether or not they are to blame. Unfortunately, for all the decent stuff laid down in the early stages, Spec Ops the Line goes fully off the rails in the ending.
You did this. No, you did.
In a hugely disappointing twist, it's revealed Walker has been delusional all along. The entire scenario, including radio conversations with antagonists, has been imagined, and he's been the bad guy all along. Given he's got two squad mates with him the entire time, and we can assume they aren't sharing in his very specific and unexplained mania, it's fairly hard to swallow.
I'm going to count to 5, then I'm pulling the trigger.
It isn't made any better by the climax of this scene, in which you're asked to choose between two halves of a broken psyche. Do you shoot the imaginary man pointing a gun at you and remain delusional, or do you kill yourself? It's absolutely dire, which is disappointing because the rest of Spec Ops the Line actually does a half-decent job of portraying the effects of PTSD. As we established at the start of this video, PTSD is a complex disorder which can manifest in a number of ways, so of course it's not going to be easy to portray accurately in a video game. Nonetheless, it's a shame it's generally represented as one of two extremes, either the catalyst for a character's metamorphosis into a stone-cold badass, or a compromising affliction that turns a character into an unreliable narrator, or even a dangerous and unpredictable individual. Given PTSD is so particular to the sufferer and so closely tied into their emotional responses, perhaps these fantastical portrayals are more appealing inclusions for game makers, as it's more obvious something is wrong. Nonetheless, they're not really doing PTSD sufferers any favours because they're transforming a disorder capable of affecting people during the most everyday occurrences into the preserve of the extraordinary and the sensational. PTSD is so debilitating because it can be set off by the most ordinary things, an unexpected loud noise, a baby crying, even something as ordinary as heavy footsteps. I think we're given sensationalised portrayals because it's easier to change the disorder to fit the player's perception rather than the other way around.
Time to go home.
I say this not to vilify game developers, but to highlight the fact mental disorders such as PTSD are complex things and require a nuanced approach if they're to be portrayed effectively. That's all I have time for in this episode, but hopefully you found it interesting. Feel free to suggest future topics in the comments or directly to me on Twitter. Most importantly, if you or someone you know is suffering, please don't do it in silence. You can find links to mental health resources in the descriptions of this video. Thanks for watching and take care.